these last 2 decades or so. So here's the question: do journalists who cover politics, economics, technology, and other cultural issues have a blind spot when it comes to religion and religiosity and other deeply held faith convictions? And if they do tend to be more secular than maybe mainstream citizens, how might journalists better get religion, quote unquote, and report on it more accurately? Tonight's talk is meant to document a set of examples, some positive, some negative, before making the case that religious literacy can be learned, and with a mention of some of the journalists, including religion journalists, but not only religion journalists, who are perhaps worth keeping an eye on, in my view, doing some interesting things and turning the corner in creative ways that are worth copying or learning from. So some of the stories come from the project I'm involved with, something that's existed since 1999. We've hosted these sort of off-site retreats for journalists for about 22 years. We've had 267 columnists, reporters, and other broadcast journalists come, and we've had 67 scholars or clerics come. And it's often not just the speeches, but the time of mixing at tables where people can get to know each other and then stay in touch, and sometimes use stories in their columns that allows the project to make it a contribution. Okay, so maybe, Catherine, we can go to the next slide, or slide 2, on the subject of religious life. And it's not super easy, then I'll just plug, and I can maybe screen share as well, but we'll see. Are others able to see that? Oh, good. So let's go one more in, if we can. Thank you very much. Okay, great. All right, so what I want to do is tell a few stories. Actually, sorry, can we go one above that to slide 2 of 7? All right, so my thought is to share a few stories from the field. So some of these are going to be funny, or attempt to be funny. They're all true, and some of them are going to be discouraging. But obviously, you know, if you're going to school at Asbury, you know that, you know, for many people in the country, religious life is not a hobby. It holds a certain special quality. It's like spectacles that give a kind of prism for understanding many of the cultural divides that are actually playing out in the world to those who are believers. Religion's a kind of explanatory framework for the devout. It's your primary identity, really. More so even than political considerations, or at least it should be, could be. So that said, many journalists misunderstand how these divides and correlations are for most people, shaped by, for many people anyway, shaped by religion. Recent years have seen a bumper crop of reporting or other scholarship that's attempting to understand or connect Americans' religious views with broader political and sociological trends. So elite journalists, challenged to recognize their biases, will sometimes work hard, and I think we saw this a good bit after 2016, at quote unquote getting out of the Acela corridor. That's that fast track Amtrak train between Boston and Washington, D.C. via New York City, where many journalists spend nearly all their working days. So there are a lot of examples of this. James and Deb Fallows from The Atlantic, a couple, impactful, traveled the country with the express interest in breaking out of their own bubble to correct some of their self-perceived misunderstandings about the country through firsthand encounters with residents from blue-collar, rural, Midwest, and Western towns. They learned a lot, and they documented that both in The Atlantic magazine and a book that they did. Similarly, David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, spent 2 years driving, quote, deep into Trump country, quote, after misreading, along with other pundits, hundreds of other pundits, really, the 2016 election. He sought to uncover the why beneath that populist, unanticipated result, at least for elites. And like a few other curious journalists, he hit the road almost as an act of penance, as he talks about. But if these journalist trends are novel, the industry realities mean that most media platforms don't have the budgets to fund reporting outside the major news hubs. And in the current economic climate, where a lot of local news media organizations are rapidly shrinking, it's hard to do this. There's the nature of newsroom assignments is that reporters are spurred by fast-paced editors who typically prefer regular deadlines and lowest common denominator pieces that are comprehensible to both religious and non-religious readers. And that means that many articles are quote unquote written for all rather than for a particular people group. Moreover, the country's top journalism schools, again, this may be of interest if you're watching this and thinking ahead about journalism school and becoming a reporter. Most of the top journalism schools are non-religious. They, just to take the top 7 right now, are Northwestern University, University of Southern California, NYU, University of Missouri, Emerson, BU, Boston University, and Stanford. That means that many graduating reporters begin their careers with an understanding of reality that's rooted in the prevailing paradigm of secular higher education, which until recently, as Peter Berger argued, has generally failed to adequately address religion as an impactful factor in the world. Given diminishing ad revenue, contemporary journalists are often expected to bring their own social media followings and publish quickly. Often they're scored by digital tools. Of course, increasingly today, the famous story of the Washington Post Bandito is not unusual, that measures the number of reader views and reader comments and interactions. So as a result, despite America's religious diversity, broad stories with broad appeal are valued more than particular pieces that cater to distinct religious audiences, let alone mutually respective engagement, that invites rather than waters down the substance of religious beliefs. Okay, so here come the stories. That makes a journalist who's tasked to cover religion often feel a bit like a fish out of water. Washington Post columnist and frequent NPR commentator, E.J. Dionne, tells a wonderful story that demonstrates this point. Once, while covering a papal tour in the United States, while traveling with the Vatican's entourage, his fellow AP journalist, Victor Sampson, turned to EJ and said in mock alarm, quote, "What are we going to write about? There's nothing but religion here." So it's a kind of a laugh line, but it has a funny way of resurging. Take what the Washington editor-in-chief today of Real Clear Politics, Carl Cannon, said after a meeting with Saddleback Church's evangelical pastor, Rick Warren, alongside a group of other prominent journalists. This was actually back in 2005. Rick said something, Carl said, it was a throwaway line, but he said, I'd sold 18 million books before I got my first review in an American newspaper. And people gasped. The woman who was sitting next to me, I won't say her name, but she's a very prominent reporter. She leaned over and whispered in my ear and she said, "That's all you need to know about bias in American journalism. 18 million books and nobody ever reviewed his book in a newspaper." Is there some deeper reality at work when it comes to religion and elite journalists? Some people suggest it's a kind of federalism dynamic in which the country is increasingly becoming many Americas. You've heard this surely. Secular New England, Pacific Northwest, secular, the Bible Belt, Middle America, Blue California, Red Texas, and so forth. Perhaps reporters, broadcast journalists, and columnists can't report religious realities in a way that pleases all constituencies. But a larger factor seems to be a lack of religious literacy and a lack of religious education amongst many elite journalists. On closer look, for example, many of the geographic stereotypes contain real nuance, like there's vibrant faith communities sometimes in Seattle, despite the fact that Seattle and Portland are dubbed oftentimes the twin capitals of secularism, the sort of least churched part of the country. Some examples come straight from leading American newspapers that prove the same point. Recall, for example, the death of Pope John Paul II on April 2nd, 2005. That week, New York Times reporter Ian Fisher was assigned to cover the papal funeral. And he wrote a wonderful piece describing how that funeral processional went, stating that the body of the 84-year-old pontiff, quote, was dressed in white and red vestments, his head covered with a white bishop's mitre, and propped up on 3 dark gold pillows. Tucked under his left arm was the silver staff called the crow's ear that he had carried in public. Well, if you grew up serving in the Catholic or Anglican or Episcopal or Lutheran altar guild, this story might sound well and good enough. The error may be hard to catch, but if you read it again or just hear it again, A crow's ear is what was put into the paper with like the word crow, like a bird, possessively his ear. The correct term, of course, is a crozier, either spelled O-S-I-E-R or O-Z-I-E-R. It's the staff carried by a Catholic or other high church cleric that you'll see going down the aisle of the sanctuary, symbolizing the Good Shepherd. But Fisher and his well-compensated team of New York Times editors missed that completely. So it's not only just put it in, but the editors missed it. Lots of stories similarly abound. The same day, the deck line in a piece by a BBC reporter stated that as mourners gathered near the Pope's funeral processional, Carmelite nuns, spelled K-A-R-M-A-L-I-G-H-T, convened. Not Carmelite, which of course is C-A-R-M-E-L-I-T-E, Carmelite nuns, which people would know if they're part of the church, but Karma-lite, like Buddhist karma. It's not just a problem of covering the Catholic papacy overseas. Washington Post columnist Mike Gerson, who worked for President Bush, George W. Bush, that is, 43, said this about the early days of the presidential campaign. In the heat of the 2000 election, the then governor, George W. Bush of Texas, made an off-the-cuff statement that we ought to take the log out of our own eye before calling attention to the speck in the eye of our neighbor. The New York Times reported the remark as a minor gaffe, what it termed an interesting variation on the saying about the pot and the kettle. The reporter, actually a fine and balanced journalist, simply didn't recognize the biblical reference. Neither did his editors, albeit taken directly from the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, that gaffe likely isn't one that would be made by the 70.6% of Americans who self-identify today as Christian, or at least the 50% of the country who is regularly in church, though perhaps, but it was the journalists who missed the reference. Okay, so let's flip to the next slide from Dean, the editor at New York Times today. His story is an interesting one, may be familiar to you already. Grew up in New Orleans, been in leadership for, I think, at least 6 or 7 years, very, very gifted voice. He said this, and just to sort of focus on that part in the middle, basically, after 2016, he did a thing on NPR. He did another thing on a couple of the Sunday talk shows that more or less says the same thing. And he's beating this drumbeat. He's also navigating a lot of very delicate currents at New York Times today, but still seems to be very respected by a lot of people around the country and a lot of his journalists. I want to make sure, that we quote, get out there and understand better what's actually going on in the country. I think about religion more because I was Catholic and I grew up in New Orleans. He's African-American. Quote, I think that the New York-based and Washington-based, two probably media powerhouses, don't quite get religion. We've got a fabulous religion writer, but she's all alone. We don't get religion. We don't get the role of religion in people's lives. And I think we can do much better. Let's flip to the next slide again, just to sort of put before you, this is probably very familiar, but this is the most recent data that we have. I think it's from 2019 about the religiosity of the country. And the numbers, every time I look at them, I don't know how you think about this, but are stunning just to see with friends who don't seem to be aligned necessarily exactly like these numbers look. The number of evangelical Protestants, which of course includes Pentecostals and includes fundamentalist threads as well as evangelicals, but is north of a quarter of the country. Mainliners have declined substantially in the last 2 decades. Afro-American Christians are still very solid, 6.5% of the maybe 11, 12% that they represent the country. The Catholic Church is down a little as well, but not like the mainliners, to 20%. If you take a pie and you just sort of try to sort of, characterize the country, it's an incredibly religious country still. And so these stories of this level of religiosity, again, a few more stories because I think it's such a great way. We've got young kids, we're always reading stories. So they tend to stick a little bit better, I think, than just raw data. These stories weren't so familiar at the Post back in 1993 when the late founder of the project I work on now, Faith Angle Forum, called Mike Cromarty, who died tragically of cancer, another Covenant College grad and a personal friend of mine. He took a call on February 1st of 1993 from Michael Weiskopf, a relatively famous Washington Post reporter. And in a column that day, Weiskopf had described those who follow TV evangelist type preachers as, quote, poor, uneducated, and easy to command, quote. It was kind of a famous screw up. And immediately the paper received a flood of criticism, and Weiskopf was eager that same day for more background on evangelical Protestants, like how large was their number? What do they really want? What's their engagement like in American public life? So Mike recommended a book highlighting a few examples of wide-ranging cultural contributions. You know, today I'm sure he would say, look, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, is evangelical. You know, here's some incredible examples of columnists who are evangelical. Of other leaders in a wide variety of domains. You know, there was nearly 81 million evangelicals at the time. Weiskopf was stunned by that figure, 81 million people, which today is even larger. The next morning, the Post issued a correction and an apology. Several years later, this same God gap between the numbers you see in front of you and the way a lot of journalists talk about them was described by Mindy Belz of World Magazine, a Christian writer herself, journalist. She tells this story of another encounter like this with Mike. A New York Times reporter called to ask Mike about the sex and culture debate raging among Southern Baptists. When Mike cited Ephesians to help the reporter understand the Baptist position, she interrupted, wait, what was that book you just mentioned? Who's the author? Who's the publisher? If evangelicals were ever going to be understood in public life, mainstream media reporters needed some remedial education. He said, I began to get a lot of really dumb questions from really smart journalists, and that was the reason for starting some of this work. There are other stories. A Pentecostal group who came to the Capitol for an anti-abortion rally, and they said, part of that, let's pray now, all of us, that God will slay everyone in the Capitol. And of course, a journalist was covering that and said, effectively, was this Pentecostal pastor advocating the murder of the Congress? Slay, this term did not resonate. Other examples, you know, can be given as well. I want to give just a couple more before we turn. You know, one journalist at the Federalist did a piece recently called, Will Someone Please Explain Christianity to the New York Times? One example was a 2014 article about a traveling group of war-weary journalists in Jerusalem, in which Times reporter Matthew Kalman referred to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as, quote, the site where many Christians believe Jesus is buried. Of course, that little verb, is buried, rather than was buried, doesn't sit quite as well with the world's 2.3 billion Christians. And it slipped by most of the Times online and traditional audience of 5.8 million subscribers. Roy Clark of the St. Petersburg Times said at the very end of his career, quote, I'm now taking seriously the theory that we mainstream journalists are different from mainstream America. We're alienated, and my blind spots all too easily blot out religious Americans. Unfortunately, that makes me less of a citizen, less of a journalist. So here's the question, what's to be done? And partly the task is encouraging and challenging journalists and their institutions and editors to listen more deeply to what's actually playing out in the world. Terry Mattingly, a voice who I think is well worth following up in New York City, he suggests that we must strive to get inside the daily lives and stories of the people we cover, a task that requires humility, ongoing learning, and time. When more time is spent between a journalist and her subject, confidence is built, and a more substantial quote emerges. Two-way respect between the source and the journalist also helps readers experience more of the breadth of pluralist diversity, including not only varieties in race, gender, LGBTQ hires, but also viewpoint diversity. Put more directly, people don't live in a religious box, but they do bring their religion to bear to the various boxes of life, from vocation to viewpoint. As Carl Cannon, who I mentioned earlier from Real Clear Politics, their editor of the DC desk, describes, if you don't know anything about religion and you're covering politics, to me that doesn't compute, because you need to know about religion if you're going to cover politics. Our newsrooms may be secular, but the American people are not secular, he said. So maybe we can flip to the next slide with this box. Thanks, Catherine. Similarly, Matthew Paris, an atheist, writing that same year in the London Times, published a provocative column entitled, "As an Atheist, I Truly Believe Africa Needs God." Like Nick Kristof of the New York Times, who tells a famous story about meeting Christian missionaries in sub-Saharan Africa, Paris had visited 9 African countries and wrote, when he came back based on firsthand observation, quote, "I become convinced of the enormous contribution Christian evangelicalism makes in Africa, sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real, countering anxiety, fear of evil spirits, of ancestors, of nature, of the wild, of a tribal hierarchy, of quite everyday things. It strikes deep into the whole structure of rural African thought. In the places we visited, every man has his own place, and call it fear or respect, a great weight grinds down on the individual spirit, stunting curiosity. But whenever we entered a territory worked by missionaries, we had to acknowledge that something changed in the faces of the people we passed and spoke to. Something in their eyes, the way they approached you, direct, man to man, without looking down, without looking away. They had not become more deferential towards strangers, in some ways less so, but more open. Maybe the next slide. And I promise to be done by 7:30 because I believe in starting and ending on time and giving time for the really interesting stuff, which is what follows. So we got 4 minutes to go at the most. This last slide, sorry. Oh, it worked. You did it. Hey, this one I wasn't planning on, but I'm so glad it's in there. Look, I worked in philanthropy for 3.5 years and on a project with Christian college students from a DC think tank before that. And the more I read, particularly from a guy named James Davison Hunter, the more I came to believe that the way you really change society or make a contribution to people that's enduring, that lasts, is not a big idea. It's not better doctrine, and it's not knowledge-based. It's about cultivating dense overlapping networks, as Hunter calls it. That is to say, a group of people working in the same direction over time. And that's what we're trying to do in the Faith Angle work that I'm so fortunate to be a part of, and that I think is a model for lasting cultural change type work that perhaps any of you might do, whether it's in journalism or otherwise. And the idea is friendship, community, and pulling along faster than you could by yourself. So anybody by chance a cyclist in the group? All right, if you're a cyclist, don't answer this question, okay? But real quick, what is the great enemy of the cyclist? Anybody know? Feel free to flip off mute. Come on, something. What's the great enemy of the cyclist?
Would it be like wind or something?
Genius. Okay, Allie Sutton, you should go to the Olympics. This is exactly it. Everybody says tax or cars, or glass on the street. The enemy is wind. And the idea of a peloton, of course, if you got 5 guys, 6 guys, 7 guys, 8 guys, is you take turns pulling in the front. You push harder when you're in the front, just that little bit of the time, 1/7 of the time, let's say. And if you do that and you take turns, the group can cover about 135, 140% of the distance that it could otherwise by yourself. It's like the geese, right? the power of dense overlapping networks, I think, is like the thing. I'm a little bit of a nerd on this. So, but anyway, the idea is if you can create a network and the power of a group, it'll go way further. That's what most good projects should be, and I think are. All right, so let's go to the next slide. The idea of a community. So that's what Faith Angle does. We get together twice a year. We go away on retreat. We've actually increased it to 3 or 4 times a year. We just introduced a forum for young journalists who are under the age of 35 with a particularly promising career called the Michael Cromartie Forum in honor of Mike, mentioned earlier. We're going to bring that back once the pandemic recedes. So keep an eye out for that. We'd love to put you on our list. We have a podcast every 2 weeks with a religion scholar, a cleric, and a journalist talking, and usually a different journalist most every time. And here's sort of the sort of pitch, I guess, is the idea of pushing back against the winds of the age will require a group, in my view. You can't do it by yourself, no matter how good your theology is when you leave Asbury. And Redeemer Church pastor Tim Keller, who's of course got cancer right now and had a wonderful piece last Sunday in the Atlantic about that, very vulnerable. He commented recently that in his experience in urban American life, most Christians, quote unquote, are just nowhere near as deeply immersed in scripture and theology as they are in their respective social media bubbles and newsfeed bubbles. To be honest, I think the woke evangelicals are just much more influenced by MSNBC and liberal Twitter. The conservative Christians are just much more influenced by Fox News and their particular loops. And they're both living in these things 8 to 10 hours a day. They go to church once a week, but they're just not immersed in the kind of biblical theological study that would nuance their media intake. It works the other way. And so I guess my closing argument and pitch to you is that, these things are in tension. And in my view, we need a rising generation of journalists that can help correct this trend line. And there are some wonderful examples. I didn't read you all the lists of people, from Emma Green at The Atlantic to Sarah Pulliam Bailey, a Wheaton grad, and Ruth Graham, Sarah Pulliam Bailey, a Wheaton grad at Washington Post, and Ruth Graham, a Wheaton grad who's at New York Times today, Elizabeth Diaz, also at New York Times in the religion department, Michelle Borstein, to Kelsey Dallas, who is Mormon, but writing at Deseret News, to a whole host of people who didn't exist 20 years ago like this, and making a news contribution, media contribution. There's a whole network, and that's not to get into the columnists who are part of Faith Angle's work or this sort of counter movement, who get it, from David Brooks at New York Times to Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic to Karen Tumulty at the Washington Post to Miranda Kennedy and Tom Gelton at NPR to people coming at it from a Jewish or a Muslim perspective, but who do get it about the value and importance of religion. And so if there are any ways that Faith Angle can help, serve as a reference point, a resource for you as you're starting your careers, or potentially support you as a participant in our Mike Cromartie Forum, which puts you into our network and on our list of journalists and the like, please just say the word. That's the end of my speech. Thanks for your time. Can't wait to talk about it, some of these ideas.
Thanks, Josh. I have a question. So you mentioned that this is going to take a group to move this thing forward. What is the responsibility for Bible-believing Christians? What is the responsibility for the individual?
As a reader or as a journalist?
As a journalist.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just think you can't sustain any worthy project by yourself in the end, because the counter winds are just too substantial. Everybody has their own story. I think the responsibility of a journalist today is to find, well, first and foremost, as a journalist, to do great work and to pursue the truth without regard to biases on any sides, including religious sides. to seek and pursue the truth and to write about it honestly, and to go where the evidence leads. And I think that project tends to happen way better, way more effectively, way more compellingly, and get more eyeballs on it too, frankly. But more than that, the thinking of the article is better when you have a group that's helping you with that. There is, for example, a very wonderful sort of, sometimes people call it the Christian intelligentsia group of DC. And those journalists who meet together on Wednesday nights help each other in their work. I don't understand this trend. What just happened here? And the like. And I have one too. There's a little groups, tend to pull you through the frame that you already say you believe in, but can easily lose in your early 20s, in my experience, as you're starting your career.
There's so many issues that religion plays a role in. So many of these hot button issues, whether it's immigration, abortion, and you can go on down the list. And at least to me, it seems like the mainstream coverage reflects a lack of appreciation for how religious people, whether they're Christian or otherwise, might feel about those issues. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we have these loops that Tim Keller describes. And if you're talking to, your pals and never think about, who's on the other end of those stats about the life question, the tone, Skip Stout at Yale used to say that what you really need to do when you write an article or when you write a PhD, a doctoral dissertation, is you need to think about one person and write that paper to that person. And in this case, he suggested your aunt, who knows not that much about the topic, is a real person. And you want to convince her. I mean, she's open, she's curious, but she's not, already decided or whatever, And I think if you're one person, if the country is split into these silos and your one person is, your roommate in Brooklyn, and you are not at all introduced to, religious voices, or certainly evangelicals or Catholics, or, then unfortunately your audience is too limited, and the tone will reflect that.
For people and young people, for the most part, here, or thinking about going into journalism, would you say there's a desire to bring that viewpoint into newsrooms, or is it just at this point, a mere curiosity about what we believe? I would hope it would be the former, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the industry's hard, and you got to earn your chops, and you got to work hard, and you got to be willing to probably spend 1 or 2 or 3 years, hustling and taking whatever assignments are given. And depends on what kind of paper you're working for. If it's a local paper and you're making $23,000, that's quite different than if it's, New York Times and you're making $85,000 in your first job, or whatever. It depends on what role. But there is a growing contingent of people who realize that deep difference in the United States is here to stay, that we've experienced it, sort of almost violently in the last 5 years in various ways. And it's not going away. And just because the election went, 81 million for Biden and 74 million for Trump, it doesn't mean that it's going away. And therefore, there is a curiosity to understand that in some places by editors who are mature and thoughtful. And we certainly hope that's the case increasingly. You don't want to go someplace where you're sort of a curiosity hire and, after a year, see ya, because that was nice. But, I think there are, I have a section of a paper I've been working on, a book that talks about a whole group of kind of parochial religious outlets, and you can choose to work for one of those, and that's fine. But there is a lot of examples today of mainstream outlets that are more sympathetic to religious viewpoints. And I think humbly going in and again, earning the right to be heard can go a great long way.
And by the way, I want to encourage everybody to get your question ready. You can either just verbalize your question or you can send it through the chat, and we will ask it for you. But now's the time to do that. I have another question. I could go on and on, but one of the things that struck me was that over the last 4 years, and particularly over the last couple of years, was the fact that the media could not understand why, and even some evangelicals couldn't understand why the support for Trump among evangelicals stayed so strong even through the last couple of years, which were especially tumultuous. And I guess it seems fairly obvious to me that it's because of his positions, or at least the party's position, on issues like right to life and things like that. Do you think that's accurate, or is it more complicated than that?
I think that's surely the driving, most dominant reason. It's the reason that people a generation above me, cite most frequently religious freedom concerns, pro-life concerns, real fears that the direction the country was moving in, especially after Obergefell, might mean that in the short future, Asbury doesn't get tax exempt. Maybe gets religious organizations get tax exempt status lost, churches, for example, but Asbury doesn't get Pell Grants or federal assistance to go to school. And wow, that's moving so fast. And you saw Hillary coming in, and maybe, I think, there's also this psychological dynamic, and everybody's heard this a million times, right? So stop me if I'm being boring, but basically it's this idea that we were an aggrieved community, getting kicked around a little too much, and that finally there's this guy from Queens who's going to bring a gun to a knife fight. And sure, we'd appreciate, somebody sticking up for us, especially once Pence got in there. And the idea was sort of like Pence could run the government and Trump would just tweet all day, and maybe it would all kind of work out. And there were some good people in the administration until, some of the character dynamics seemed to unravel. So I think, how was it that 81% of vote casting white evangelicals went for Trump in 2016, and roughly 77% of vote casting white evangelicals went for him in 2020? That was a surprise to certainly some of the journalists I work with, who were like, wow, what's, really the character dynamic doesn't seem to matter for you guys, and I think that psychological dynamic, plus the party platform, plus the sort of desire to check Washington and have a disruptor who's just going to break the place up for a while, all converged in a strange populist moment that meant that, those elites in DC on the East Coast could be checked. Maybe a strange choice. I think implications that are going to be very at work in all of our, starting out careers. But I think maybe those were some of the driving motives.
What is or can the role of the Christian journalist be in a media climate that is so deeply divided between right and left? I mean, we live in a world of extremes where, you talked earlier about a genuine search for truth was what journalism is supposed to be. Although, at least in my view, very few media organizations seem committed to actually doing that. It sounds great to talk about, but actually doing it on the ground is another issue. How do we change that landscape?
Right, right. I mean, and especially if this is sort of tied to the first question from Jonathan about, advancing Christianity without sounding preachy as a journalist. I guess I've been really humbled, moved by the tone of some of the columnists that are involved in Faith Angle's work, insofar as they don't have to say everything. Articles can end with a sort of hanging open question that is over to the reader, as if, we don't have to solve it in 700 words. This is something we're wrestling with. And so it's an open question for us. And I really like that. When I worked in philanthropy, we funded a project that was filmmaking in connection with Christian schools, Christian seminaries. And they would go to Sundance and they would learn from the films at Sundance as they were making films themselves. And the idea was, we get to be okay with holding up a certain doubt, a certain skepticism, and not needing to have the quick or glib answer all the time. As part of the work, part of the vocational work is to do that. So I think, strangely, one of the best ways to help advance Christianity in the workplace as a journalist, particularly as a younger journalist, is to work hard, to pay your dues, to write good stories that are true, that would hold up 3 years from now, but very much, earning the right to be heard, kind of a thing. Slow is best. Cultivate relationships. See if you can do what your boss asks, and have a group of Christian friends and stick at it for a while, rather than, I assure you, it's not realistic to think that a really, really interesting article that has Jesus in it is going to convince your, superiors to change their life completely.
It's a question from Matthew. He said, when you talk about dense overlapping networks, does that refer to work that takes multiple lifetimes to complete, or a group or community that can work together in a single same time frame?
Yeah,
Is this...
the answer is yes. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a good thing. It's the best thing to work on a project that is big enough that you'll never solve it. I think, that's worth getting up in the morning. And whether that's the cultural mandate of Genesis, or the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, that you're really thinking about primarily, or the idea of, journalists getting religion, or 7 billion people on the planet embracing a shared faith and sense of truth. There's a big questions. I think one little trick on that, especially if you work in an organization, is to think about the half-life of the organization beyond where you are. So if you're part of a paper that's been around for 40 years, think about the next 20 years, especially if you're the leader of the organization, like the CEO, you should be thinking that way. But if you're part of a student newspaper and it's been around for, 25 years, think about, what are we gonna do in the next dozen years? What's that trajectory look like, and how can my limited contributions these 3 or 4 years, fit into that? That half-life of the organization theme, I think, has come up from people we respect, and I think that's worth considering. So for me, the next 10 years, whatever, it depends on what your project is. But yeah, should it take longer than our lifetime? That'd be great if it's a big goal. If we're a group that's working together in the same time, is it fitting into that? I think the answer is yes to both.
This is from Alejandra. What are some practical ways for journalists to keep in touch with the views of average people? You in one of those earlier slides you missed, it said how disconnected the editor of the New York Times admitted they were just completely disconnected with how people feel about religion and what impact it makes in their lives. How do we as journalists understand what quote unquote average people are thinking and feeling?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one idea I think is, use opportunities that you have to talk to taxi drivers. Depends where you're living. Stay in touch with your, distant relatives or friends that aren't in your world from time to time, and the pandemic's been a great opportunity on this, call somebody you haven't talked with for a little while and see what they're thinking about this. I mean, everybody and their mother had something to say about Trump these last 4 years. So that's one springboard, but now what is the attitude of my, not just parents on the pandemic's vaccine, but also, some friends from high school days or whatever, right? Like, so I think there's something about just, using your network. And the other thing is, when you're going through a parking garage and somebody looks at your eyes, ideally you're not doing this, and that's very hard. Only way to meet people face to face, which is what the whole thing's about. This is just a in between on the way to face to face, is to be able to meet them in the eyes too, right? So that's
Yeah. And by the way, I will say parenthetically, be careful about engaging your mother in conversation. My mother asked me about the election and she wound up yelling at me. So it's
a big group of us, Rich. Me too.
It's delicate. So just tread cautiously. This is from Lexi. Recently in class, we've discussed ethics in journalism. I know this because that was my class. How would you intertwine religion with ethics? And do you think it's better to have a religious background when dealing with tricky issues? And Josh, for your background, we were going through various real life scenarios that actually happened and how to handle them and trying to be sensitive to the reputations and lives of the people on whom we're reporting. So that's kind of where the question comes from.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the same vein as sort of get your small group who can help you stay accountable, it helps to marry up. If you have a spouse who, is of the mind that, you need to tell the full truth. You can't say everything and you shouldn't say everything, but you need to say something that's actually true when you write. There are those of us, right, who believe that you got the ends and the means, and the ends are worthy. Like, come on, we got to sort of, that's not exactly what my source said. She didn't exactly say that, but it's the heart of what she was overall meaning. And, if she would have said that, it would be perfect in the story right here. So I'm going to write the quote that way. It's not going to be a deal. I'm not even going to name her. I'm just going to sort of, that stuff gets a little delicate. You want to live out of the truth. My father used to always say that if you take the red letters in the scripture, you can push them all the way down and they are still true. Whereas I think a lot of times when you take the letters that any of us would write in a paper, you're kind of bending a little bit at this and that place, it's different. And so you sometimes less is more. That's actually true. And but it's a great question. And I do think ethics and religion swirl together. And usually, to me, the deeper well is religion, and ethics springs right out of that. My old prof used to say, you got religious worldview on the bottom, you got values on top of that. And then you've got institutions that are not going anywhere, although they do change some. And then you've got what you actually read in the paper. So above the iceberg, kind of in the iceberg. And it affects itself up, and it affects itself down. So if things start changing long enough on the surface, it will change your values and your religion. And I think that was a danger of the Trump years, but that's not to digress to that topic. So, I think that's how the ethics religion wellspring flows up.
This is from Andrew. It's an interesting question. What are some ways that Christian reporters tend to be biased, and how can we avoid those biases?
Yeah, I just think there's so much to be learned from journalists who don't put up with BS and who call us on that sometimes. A lot of the best journalists that I work with today, including one I was on the phone with yesterday from Paris at Financial Times, he doesn't say a lot. He's like the Edge in the band U2. He doesn't say a lot, but when he does, you'd better listen, and he's just sort of like 8 words is kind of like, ooh, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. So I think there are super smart people in the journalism field and world, really some exceptionally bright people, and they will call us on stuff, and we should learn from them. Any relationship two-way only is fruitful if if the respect is dual. And so I think it tends to happen. And as to how we can be biased ourselves, we all have, my mentor used to say that Christians get the privilege of understanding the world that is directionally accurate. We get to understand that really it's true: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. So we have a directional leg up on the rest of the culture. However, there are chinks in our armor, and there are holes in our, outlook, worldview. And there are plenty of scientists that understand certain things about the way molecules work and disease prevention happens, et cetera, epidemiologists who have so much to contribute that we don't understand. So we best, understand that we may be a leg up on the directional, but we need to sort of approach that humbly and be open to it. So I think, Christian reporters can tend to be biased out of misapplied doctrines and out of upbringings that are rooted in a broken story and have a political edge to it, and all kinds of things, right? And we get to be made better and more like part of a rock tumbler in the context of friendships with smart colleagues who may not share our faith.
This is from Josiah. Do you think it's too late for some journalists to see the viewpoint of the average American? I mean, have we gone crossed some threshold where we're just permanently out of touch?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess by we, I'm not sure. I guess the we could be just the media generally, or just reporters generally.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, you got people who are 2 years away from retirement and pretty edgy and pretty biased and pretty crotchety. You're not going to win that guy, and you got people used to always talk about this. I did some work in prisoner reentry for a while, and they'd say there's a third of the guys who should just be in there. They're not going to change their minds. They really should be in prison, and then there's a third of the guys that probably shouldn't be in there, and they'll be fine if you get a little support and that you're working with their character in a way. And then you got a third that's sort of maybe in the middle in various ways. But so I think that's probably how it is with journalists, right? Like there are some people who are not going to probably change. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying, but the line we heard from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who visited with some journalists in the fall, was that especially in this sort of Trump era, when there's a sort of smugness and self-righteousness that is louder than it's been, or sure seems that way in journalism, you want to run with the horses, who are, more pursuing righteousness, pursuing humility, not those who are self-righteous, and just find a way to get in friendship camps and the like with like-minded people who want to become better and righteous, not and humble, not just grow their social media platform and be jerks.
This is from Blaine. Do you think Christian journalists should ever avoid writing on certain topics, especially in the form of opinion pieces?
Yeah, I think that just takes wisdom, if you grew up Southern Baptist and your editor says, please write on this guy who just, in Atlanta, killed 6 Asian women and 2 others, 2 white women, you might just, I don't know what, right? Just want to be careful how you play the card about, you don't want to get in the position of having to defend the Southern Baptist, convention or denomination just because that's yours. You don't want to overly explain unless you've done the work in interviews, to better understand from his church or whatever, So I think sometimes there's a temptation when we have a special in, like we knew that community or tribe somehow, to kind of really get our name out there, but just have to be careful, I guess, to play that card if it maybe isn't actually, grounded, accurate. but that may not be a great example. Of course, there are other topics where, we want to just be careful. On the other hand, Christian journalists should certainly be glad to speak, whether it's in print or not, on virtually, any topic, including the toughest, whether that's, attitudes about vaccine or trafficking or politics or whatever else. So I think you got to live by the Spirit in that space. And
Josh, I'm curious, you had mentioned a lot of the religious or Christian journalists that you guys deal with. Are there more out there than we, and I mean just consumers, think that there are? I mean, because we may have this impression that it is a completely underrepresented worldview within the media, and I guess it is underrepresented, but maybe it's not as underrepresented as we think, or as I think.
Yeah, I went to HDS for grad school, and a lot of people there had religious upbringing, and most people there were in the middle of sort of, jadedly ditching that in some way, walking away from it. I grew up in the church, and here's what happened to me and why I'm walking away. So I think there's a lot of that in journalism, honestly. But I mean, those stats from Pew, they reflect the country. And today's journalists, including, Gen Xers and including millennials and including, people a generation above, boomers, they all grew up in that context. So I think there is more faith and familiarity with religion amongst journalists than we can tend to think by the sort of, no, journalists are elite secularists, mantra. And it's fascinating because in my job, honestly, like normally I'll go to breakfast with a newer journalist and ask, what made you decide to become a journalist, to begin with? What was the dream, And, eventually at the table, there's usually at least some, faith story or faith mention, Jewish. Now I'm not religious, but I'm Jewish, or, I grew up in the Catholic Church, but no thank, so there's a lot of that. And I think everybody's got a story, and that's a critically, compelling part of what to tap into if there's going to be a renewed turn toward this side of the coin. Oh, we're on mute. Yes.
Sorry, I was muted. I only did it once, so I'm way ahead. I usually do it many more times. Are any other questions out there? I don't want to leave a question on the table if there is one.
Yeah, there's one from Ella. She was asking about the role of religion in newsrooms. She says, I know that as journalists, we try to maintain an unbiased perspective, but we also believe as Christians that we are called to be the light of the world. How do those things interact in the setting of the newsrooms themselves?
Yeah. I just think that that's absolutely right. And my read, as I interact with journalists who have navigated the waters and been successful, and others who have been at it for a while and then decided to get off the bus, is that you get to be a part of the light of the world at the beginning through doing your work in a way that reflects being part of the light of the world, not the darkness of the world. So you do great work, and you tell the truth, and you engage your neighbors well. And when people are curious, you do not shy away from being able to talk candidly and in love and humility about Christ and about hope. And if people come to church with you, that's terrific, but I think it's, it's just important. The posture when you start a first job, it's your most important year. When you get out of college, and now some people may be in grad school, so that's more complicated. But if you're the first year out of college, in my experience, in my opinion, is the most important year because you truly are setting your own habits. You've got your own income, you're living your own life. And so friendships matter an awful lot. And the way to be compelling with colleagues, especially considerably more senior colleagues, is through, you know, I'm beating the drum here, but, you know, sort of like through diligence, through hard work, through service, through excellence. If somebody needs to stay at the office till 10 o'clock, you stay at the office till 10 o'clock.
And just to add to what you said, Josh, I mean, it is important too, when those opportunities do arise, to share something about our faith, that we have our theology, that we are biblically literate, so we can explain to people why we believe what we believe. I found that's come up, you know, many times in my professional life. This is a question from Marianne. What do you think about the response from the media about COVID-19? And how should a Christian journalist write an opinion on how we should respond? How should we should respond to COVID with Christian views? I guess maybe she's planning on writing something about COVID-19.
Well, if you do, Marianne, I hope you'll check out a couple of resources. One is this project called Christians and the Vaccine that's being led up by Curtis Chang, a teacher at Fuller Seminary and at Duke Divinity School right now, former pastor, Harvard College undergrad, and a buddy. We're going to interview him tomorrow on Faith Angles podcast with lead journalist from the Washington Post who has been managing the COVID rollout in DC, the policy for the city, the different wards. So she's a secular Jew who previously held a role at the religion desk and has now sort of been tasked to cover coronavirus stuff. And he's an evangelical Christian, Asian American. So that'll be fun. There's one out today with David French and Curtis Chang together. I don't know if you guys know David's voice or not. He's not that far in Nashville, but they did a podcast with BioLogos that's quite good as a sort of resource. I mean, to me, this one hurts. You know, the idea that 2% of white evangelicals currently do not plan to take the vaccine is a little painful in our tribe, in my opinion. I mean, you know, people have strong thoughts. If you're pregnant, that's one thing, but this is, in my view, the primary way on the back end of a year of COVID to love our neighbor. And the idea that a lot of us would just choose not to do it. Now, there may be other tacks. Francis Collins is part of this same Bible study group I mentioned earlier, head of the NIH, Christian. He's sort of dumbfounded is my take. I mean, he's like, we worked so hard. We had some of the technology very early, but we worked so hard to make it safe, reliable. The idea that my fellow tribe would not, if we don't get to 70 to 90%, you know, the herd immunity principle isn't going to work. And if evangelicals, if half of white evangelicals, which is like 12% of the country, don't take it, you know, that's a not positive contribution to how the herd, you know, becomes well again on the backside of this thing. So it's complicated, I know, beyond that, and I don't want to suggest that I've got all the answers on that, but the attitudes are surprising, and you know, I personally hope more Christians, you know, would be open to taking it, willing to take it. I don't think we'll be harmed by it. I don't the data, you know, but there. Christians.
I mean, the numbers, the percentages are eye-popping, really. I mean, when you're up in the, I was shocked when I saw that it was like in the 40s and not, you know, in the single digits.
Right.
But
Right.
very, very surprised. Any other questions? No? Well, Josh, we really appreciate you being with us tonight. This was great. Come back again when we can see you in person. Come back to campus at some point.
Well, that'd be a joy. Thanks for the time. Come to DC as well. Like, come work here. Tell me. Stay in touch.
And I'd like to thank Catherine, who has put all these together. And just the fact of the matter is, none of this would ever happen without Catherine. So, Catherine, again, thank you, and thanks for everybody for attending. And Josh, we hope to see you soon.
Can't beat it. You guys too. All best. Good luck.
Take care. Bye-bye.